Welcome to Vital Voices, our session on sex addiction. Is it real? I want to thank everyone for joining us, those of you who are online and those of you who are here. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about UHD. I want to brag on us a little bit that the Wall Street Journal recently ranked UHD among the 400 best colleges in the United States. And specifically, we were recognized as being number 1 for diversity and number 3 for student experience. There's a lot of good stuff happening here at UHD, especially right here in the College of Public Service. For instance, our Masters of Science in Criminal Justice program has been recognized as one of the best online programs in the country by U.S. News and World Report for the 6th year in a row. Now, we believe in public service as a career, whether it's in urban education, criminal justice, or social work. It's a calling pursued by individuals who are passionate about contributing to the well-being of our community. Now, as you may know, Vital Voices serves as a forum to bring to the UHD community scholars and practitioners who work on issues vital to the functioning of our democracy. Our guest speakers speak from their professional experience and expertise about the work that they do, how it impacts society, and it's our intention to showcase individuals whose work is interdisciplinary and it touches upon the fields of social work, criminal justice, and urban education. Over the years, we've explored a plethora of different subjects relevant to our community, such as addiction, which we'll be talking about again today, youth in the criminal justice system, homelessness, reducing recidivism, the graying of America, immigration, school violence, childhood grief and trauma, bail reform, cognitive dissidence, voting justice, modern-day slavery, and recently we had some sessions on the rise of AI. So upcoming sessions next week, on next Thursday evening, we're going to be doing a session on porn and sexual violence. Is there a link? So that'll be next Thursday from 5:30 to 7. You can attend in person or via Zoom, as you can for all of our sessions. At the end of the month, we're going to have a session called 200,000 African Americans and the Other Great Migration, from when in the early 1930s and 40s we had an influx of African Americans into the city of Houston, despite issues with the city of Houston. Beginning of March, we're going to have the anti-Muslim bigotry, status quo, self-reflection, and hopes. Then at the end of March, we're going to have for Women's History Month, we're going to have the rise of Black women in higher education. And then a really interesting workshop in April, beginning of April, we're going to have what's called a red-blue workshop, and we're following up on a workshop that we just had called Disagreeing Better, and it was put on by an organization called Braver Angels, which helps people to figure out how we can talk better with each other without hating each other, respectful discourse. So we're going to have a red-blue workshop, and what that is we're going to have 8 people who sign up as Republicans or conservative versus 8 people who sign up as Democrats or liberal, and then we're going to have 20 people in the room actually sort of not moderating, but being their audience, and we're going to engage in a full-day workshop on how to talk with people who have diametrically opposed views on issues of politics. And then our last session of the year is going to be on school choice. What's the fuss? What's it all about? We'll have the pro and we'll have the con. So now let me introduce to you our speaker. He is Dr. Jake Porter, who was a licensed professional counselor and professor with expertise in developmental neurobiology, attachment theory, addiction, trauma, and relational dynamics. As the creator of couple-centered recovery, he has developed an innovative approach for helping couples rebuild trust and heal after betrayal trauma. Dr. Porter is the CEO of Daring Ventures, a counseling and coaching organization where he works with individuals and couples to foster emotional resilience, relational wholeness, and personal growth. With a passion for integrating clinical science and spiritual formation, Dr. Porter offers insights that are both psychologically profound and deeply practical. His unique perspective is informed by years of experience in counseling, teaching, and coaching, combined with his commitment to understanding the intersections of spirituality, human development, relationships, and emotional well-being. Dr. Porter is a board member of the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Specialists and an accomplished speaker, who regularly addresses academic, faith-based, and professional audiences on topics such as relational trauma, empathy, and the neuroscience of connection. He lives in Houston with his wife, Kristen, and daughters Magnolia Jane and Lottie Joe. Welcome, Dr. Porter.
Thank you. Really happy to be here with you, whether you're here in the flesh or virtually. Glad to be here with you. And we're going to be talking about this question of whether or not sex can be addictive. And spoiler alert, my answer is yes. That is not settled, though. That is not necessarily settled. There are people who would disagree with my answer, and that's okay. But I'm going to lay out for you why I think the answer is yes, and help you understand kind of what's happening in this field. This is a field where there's a whole lot happening right now, and hopefully take your questions along the way. To that end, let me just say I don't mind being interrupted at all. So if you have a question while I'm talking, you want to ask me something, just speak up. That's going to be happening for you online as well. Someone's monitoring the questions there, so you can throw in a question. But I also have planned this to have some time at the end for questions. So let me talk about sort of the overview of where I'm planning to go here. First, I'm going to give some definitions of sex addiction and compulsive sexual behavior, or compulsive problematic sexual behavior disorder. We're going to talk about the etiology, which is where does it come from? What's going on there? I'm going to get into some more symptomology in that section as well. And here I'm going to focus on shame trauma, specifically attachment trauma. And, I have shame twice on my slide because it's a big deal. And then we'll talk about impact on partners, families, and the self. So how this phenomenon ends up showing up in households, in family systems, a little bit in communities and relationships, dyads, and then future directions in the field. So there is a lot of debate going on right now about this question. Is this something real? Is sex addiction a real disorder, or is it an excuse for bad behavior? Is it just something, he got caught. And you'll hear about this once a year or so in the news. Some celebrity gets caught engaging sex workers or something like that, and then goes off to treatment somewhere. Okay, well, that's a convenient excuse, right? So that's one storyline that's out there. Another question that some people have is this just like a moral failing? Is it just they're just a bad apple, right? Like bad character defect. Something's wrong with this person. They're immoral. Or is this actually a mental health issue? Is it an addiction? And I'm going to talk a little bit today about, is this addiction versus compulsivity? What's the difference between those two? We're not going to get into all of that. I teach whole semester-long courses on this, so we're not going to be able to cover every single angle of it, but we're going to get into that a little bit. So is it really an addiction, kind of like drugs or alcohol, or is this something else entirely that we're dealing with here? So those are some of the questions that people have, and I've been on television shows and talked about this. I've been all around the country, spoken to groups across the world. I talked to a group from New Zealand recently. This is a conversation that's being had everywhere. It's happening everywhere, this conversation. And what I'm encouraged by is that I think that we are getting somewhere finally. I think that we're actually getting somewhere so that the conversation can move beyond, is it possible to be addicted to sex? Because that's kind of where it's been treading water for, I would say, 40-ish years, 45 to 50 years or so. So let's get into some definitions here. Well, the first thing I want to just admit is that a lot of people misunderstand the difference between sex addiction and sex offending. And this is really, really important. So I'm licensed in the state of Texas as a licensed professional counselor, okay? I do psychotherapy primarily with couples. In the state of Texas, as well as in many other states in the United States, if you're going to work with sexual offenders as a population, that requires its own particular licensure. In Texas, we call that an LSOTP, a licensed sexual offender treatment provider. I am not an LSOTP. I do not treat sex offenders, okay? I treat sex addicts. A lot of people hear a sex addict, they think sex offender. So I want to start by just helping make sure that we're all clear that we're not talking about sex offenders. A sex offender has broken a law and has done so in a way that they have violated the boundaries of another person, all right? There's usually a lack of consent in that, okay? And while there can be overlap between these two categories, there doesn't have to be. I have met sexual offenders. They've come into the office not knowing that there's a difference and not knowing that I can't treat that, and we do assessments. I've met them. I understand what's going on with a lot of that. I've met sex addicts, thousands of them, okay? And I've met some who bridge both. But we have to understand that there's a distinction between the two. I chose just one study to highlight that the distinction between sex offenders and sex addicts is more than merely legal. So this isn't just a matter of, did you break a law or not? And if you broke a sex offense law, then you're in the category of sexual offender as opposed to sexual addict. It's more than that. This is a 2019 study. Efrati, Shukran, and Epstein found that individuals in sex addiction programs experience higher levels of compulsive sexual behavior disorder, maladaptive cognitive schemas, impulsivity, and sensation seeking compared to sex offenders. The pronounced presence of maladaptive schemas among sex addiction members may contribute to their elevated levels of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And so this underscores the importance of addressing these very specific cognitive distortions and impulsivities in treatment interventions, and having a tailored approach to treat this population as opposed to the offender population. All of that. That's a bunch of clinical jargon to say this. What's going on inside of these two populations is significantly different. It's different in terms of their cognitive schema, their thinking patterns. It's different in terms of their impulsivity and what's going on there. It's very different behavior, both on the outside and what's driving it on the inside. So I am not talking about sexual offenders today, all right? I also want to admit that sex addiction is not in the current edition of the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual. If you're not familiar with what the DSM is, this is like the handbook that mental health professionals use to give diagnoses, to diagnose people with particular mental health disorders. So depression, anxiety disorders, OCD, lots of different disorders. They're in here, and this is the manual that is put out by the American Psychiatric Association that gives the criteria that must be met to receive a certain diagnosis. And then there's a particular code associated with that, and that is necessary for insurance. Insurance drives a whole lot of healthcare. That'd be a great lecture series right there, if you want to get real controversial, is how the money drives the system. Because a lot of people who are very much against this concept of sex addiction, they're against it because they say, well, it's not in the DSM. And there's a lot of money to keep it out of the DSM. Again, that's a whole different conversation, all right? But that is not a good argument for its lack of existence. Just a few versions of the DSM ago, just a few previous editions ago, guess what wasn't in the DSM? PTSD, as an example. Well, just because PTSD wasn't in the DSM, does that mean it didn't exist? Nobody would claim that. The publication of something in the DSM doesn't make it exist. It's an acknowledgement that it exists. All right? So that is not a good argument. And again, there's a lot of politics and a lot of money involved in why it didn't make it into this last edition. However, for decades now, in the clinical, people actually on the ground helping folks, coming to their office, describing this problematic sexual behavior, there's been an understanding that sex can look like an addiction. Patrick Carnes is probably the forefather, not probably, he is sort of the forefather in this field. And he's a PhD who starting in the 70s and especially in the 80s, began working on sex addiction. He was on the Phil Donahue show, which a lot of you are probably too young to know who Phil Donahue is. But I remember Phil Donahue. Phil Donahue just ridiculed him in the 80s. You think people could be addicted to sex? Ha, ha, ha. Well, we'll see who's laughing in the end. But what Carnes did, one of the things that Carnes did was he took typical criteria that work for any addiction and he just applied it to sex. And that's what these 10 here are. And I'm just going to read them real quick, and you can kind of answer some of these. You may want to tally in your mind. If the reason you're interested in this is personal, you just maybe tally these up in your own mind. Have you repeatedly failed to resist sexual impulses to engage in specific sexual behavior? Have you frequently engaged in those behaviors to a greater extent or over a longer period of time than intended? Do you have a long-standing desire or a history of unsuccessful efforts to stop, reduce, or control those behaviors? Have you spent excessive time in obtaining sex, being sexual, or recovering from sexual experiences? Do you become obsessed with preparing for sexual activities? Have you frequently engaged in sexual behavior at times when you were expected to be fulfilling occupational, academic, domestic, or social obligations? Have you continued your sexual behavior despite knowing it has caused or exacerbated persistent or recurrent social, financial, psychological, or physical symptoms for you? Do you need to increase the intensity, frequency, number, or risk of sexual behaviors to achieve the desired effect? Or do you experience diminished effect when continuing behaviors at the same level of intensity, frequency, number, or risk? Number 9, have you given up or limited social, occupational, or recreational activities because of your sexual behaviors? And finally, number 10, do you become upset, anxious, restless, or irritable if you are unable to engage in sexual behaviors? You could take every single one of those, take out sexual behaviors, put in, use alcohol, use a chemical drug. Actually, you could stick in there shopping. You could stick in there gambling. You could stick in there gaming. 3 is the threshold for diagnosis. So if you answer yes to 3 or more of those questions, you meet criteria for sex addiction. Now, a couple of things. One of the critiques of sex addiction as a concept is that it's actually based on our puritanical culture in which sex is bad and sex is shameful and blah, 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 blah. So one of the things that I do with clients, and I've had this happen, clients have come in, they've claimed to be sex addicts, and they're not. Maybe they've done some sexual acts that are against their own values and they feel guilt and shame about it, but they're not sex addicts. Okay? So this set of criteria has been used for decades. It has not been established in the research literature to the point, obviously, that it's in the DSM, as I mentioned. But I have clinically found it to be very effective in working at this point, literally, in one capacity or another, with thousands of different addicts. There was big news back in 2018, though, when the World Health Organization, in its ICD-11, which is sort of their equivalent to the DSM, the World Health Organization included a new diagnosis in the 11th edition of the ICD. And it's the diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. Now, this was huge. This was huge. And they're claiming this disorder as a compulsivity disorder, not an addictive disorder, which I will talk about more in just a moment. But you can see on the slide here, this is right from the ICD-11 on the criteria for compulsive sexual behavior disorder, which is the term that I'll mostly use for the rest of the lecture because it's what's now established in the field. So it's defined as a persistent pattern of failure to control intense, repetitive sexual impulses or urges, resulting in repetitive sexual behavior. Symptoms may include repetitive sexual activities becoming a central focus of the person's life to the point of neglecting health and personal care or other interests, activities and responsibilities, numerous unsuccessful efforts to significantly reduce repetitive sexual behavior, and continued repetitive sexual behavior despite adverse consequences or deriving little or no satisfaction from it. And then you can see the criteria there. I'm not going to read those to you. You can read that for yourself. But I want to hone in on something that I'm really grateful the way they worded this, because it's an important thing, I think, to understand about sex addiction and something I like to correct whenever I get to speak to groups publicly. And it's that last phrase that says, despite adverse consequences or deriving little or no satisfactions from it. So when I'm on a plane, well, thankfully, now I have 2 little girls and nobody wants to sit next to us or talk to me. But when I happen to be flying alone, or back before I had children, and people, want to chit-chat on the plane, which I'm not a big plane chit-chatter, but they would want to chit-chat, I'd always try to read them. If I tell them what I do, will that scare them away? Or will that make them really interested? And if I thought it would scare them away, I'd tell them, well, I'm a certified sex addiction therapist. And, okay. And then they'd, bury their nose in their magazine. Sometimes I got it wrong. I'd misread it. And people were, oh, that's so interesting. And here's what I get it. I don't want to be like overly critical or judge these folks, but I cringe every time I heard it. People who would say something like, oh man, I probably need your help. I love sex. That is not sex addiction. Sex addiction is not, oh, I love sex too much, so much. What's actually happening with sex addiction is it's very, very sad. It has little to do with sex, first of all, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But they don't derive pleasure from it. They tell themselves they will, and yes, there may be a moment in that peak moment of orgasm or climax where there's a surge of dopamine and oxytocin and these other chemicals. But it is almost immediately, as that rushes out, that space is filled with shame and despair. And the reality of most addictions, some would say all addictions even, is that by the time you are well into an addiction, you're no longer chasing a high. You're trying to outrun a withdrawal. That's a key difference. You're not chasing a high. You're trying to outrun a withdrawal. So there's something else that is driving the behavior, that's something else that I'm trying not to feel, I'm trying not to experience, and this behavior helps me not feel that for some time, for a moment. Okay? So anyway, 2018 World Health Organization, compulsive sexual behavior disorder was added. Huge deal, really big deal. So what's the deal? Addiction versus compulsion. What's going on here? And so I've got a little chart here with the help of ChatGPT. And we've got sex addiction under the Patrick Carnes model versus compulsive sexual behavior disorder from the ICD-11, the World Health Organization, and just impulse control disorders in general. So how does this fit? And you can see this chart. One of the main distinctions between, when we're talking clinically, between a compulsion and an addiction is that a compulsion is going to come, an addiction is going to come with withdrawal symptoms and is going to be tied to hijacked dopaminergic pathways, altered dopaminergic pathways in the brain. So addictions have those modified, those hijacked reward pathways, those dopaminergic pathways, and when it's not engaged, there's a withdrawal experience. Impulse control disorders don't have those symptoms. Okay, so if you actually look at what was published when compulsive sexual behavior disorder was added to the ICD-11, they actually say in there it might be an addiction. They just need more research first. And that is happening right now. That's happening now. And I think it's a matter of time before it gets moved from the impulse control disorders section into the addiction section of the ICD. Because I can tell you clinically, as I work with this population, there are definitely withdrawal symptoms. And there are definitely dopaminergic reward pathways that are often involved. Now, I won't say every single time, but very often involved here. It's not merely a lack of impulse control. This is a really big wordy slide that I have no intention of reading to you, but you can skim it if you want. I just picked one study that has been done recently. This is a study actually based on looking at both structures in the brain and functionality of those structures in the brain, using fMRI studies and other measures. So this is hard science measures, not qualitative research, not interviewing people. This is actually scanning the brain. And it shows that those with compulsive sexual behavior disorder really do have brain function and structural differences in the brain that look like addiction, not merely impulse control disorders. So there you have that. I'm happy to share these slides with anybody if you want to geek out to that later. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the etiology. Etiology, like where does it come from, right? And we're also going to get into some symptomology here because I think that they blur. This is a really granular, bad quality graphic chart, but I love it. It's from Patrick Carnes. It is also, I want to just own and admit, this is very dated. This research. This is from 2004, some of the work of Patrick Carnes, but it was an extensive study of thousands of participants, of men in residential treatment for sex addiction. And they looked at, okay, well, how does someone become a sex addict? How does this happen? And I'm going to walk you through this really quickly. We're not going to look at every single line of it, but you're going to get the big picture of it. And we start right up there in the top right corner where that red arrow is going into this sort of square here, and it says family. So in Carnes' work, in his research with this large population of male sex addicts, he found that 87% of sex addicts came from families that had other addicts in the family system. Okay? That is a very high number. That is too high to be chance, right? 77% from a rigid family system, 87% from a disengaged family system, 68% from a rigid and disengaged family system. So these key factors. Is there an addict in the family system, at least one, and is the family system marked by rigidity and disengagement? Okay? Those are very high occurring among the sex addiction population. Those are the ingredients that lead to early experiences of abuse and trauma. 97% of sex addicts experienced emotional abuse or trauma in their childhood. That's stunning. That's stunning, right? 81% experienced sexual abuse and 72% experienced physical abuse. So that kind of a family system is the system in which abuse and trauma happens, okay? That leads to these various ways of dealing with trauma. And I'm not going to go through all of those, but basically what those are is, okay, now I've got this trauma. If I'm the kid that grew up in that system, I've had to learn to deal with the trauma. And I'm going to come up with ways of trying to manage it. I'm going to have trauma reactions, look for pleasure, blocking, splitting, abstinence, shame, all of these different things. All of that is like noise in my system, okay? And it's all also, it's like the kindling, okay? Waiting for the catalytic environment and the catalytic stressor. Something finally happens where the match is lit, boom, and thrown on what has been prepared throughout childhood. And that can be something like at age 13, someone discovers their dad's Playboy collection. I've heard that story 100 times, okay? It could be at age 22, my college girlfriend cheated on me. Boom. It could be I went off to college and experienced high-speed internet for the first time, which, I mean, that would be someone growing up in the 90s if you experienced high-speed internet for the first time in college, probably. But, and then access to porn and boom, it takes off. I mean, there's lots of potential things, but something happens that lights this, the match, and the match gets thrown into this internal world that has been cultivated for this. Once that happens, the sexual addiction pops up. What you see there, compulsive behavior, loss of control, efforts to stop, loss of time, that's all those diagnostic criteria I read you earlier from that slide. What percentage answered yes to each of the diagnostic criteria. And then then those diagnostic criteria and the sex addiction gets expressed in various subcategories of sex addiction: fantasy, voyeurism, exhibitionism, seductive role sex, intrusive sex, and there's even more than that now that we know about. So subcategories, subtypes of sex addiction. Just like not all alcoholics are the same. You've got one alcoholic who drinks a case of beer a day, okay, and you got another one who gets drunk on, 4 martinis a day. This looks very different, okay, but it's still alcohol addiction, right? So the behaviors behind sexual addiction can look different. And there's huge crossover. So other addictions, if you have sex addiction, you're very likely to have other addictions. Of the population of sex addicts that Karin studied, 42% had a chemical dependency issue. 38% had an eating disorder. 28% compulsive working, 26% compulsive spending, and 5% compulsive gambling. That number of compulsive gambling we know is way higher now, way higher with internet gambling. And then there's this thing called addiction interaction disorder, which is how the interplay of the two addictions. But you know what that sets up for? A family in which a kid is raised with an addict and a rigid and disengaged system. And round and round and round it goes from one generation to the next. All right? How am I doing? Okay, doing pretty good on time. All right, I want to simplify that a little bit, though, and not look at it quite so much from a systemic family system perspective, but look at it from more of an intra and interpersonal system of just looking at the child. Someone starting as a child. It starts often, not 100% of the time. Hear me clearly. This is not 100% of people with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, but many, 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 many most, okay? Early neglect or trauma. So early in your life, from infancy into early childhood, the way your nervous system develops optimally requires an external nervous system of a caregiver to build into you the capacity for self-regulation, right? Infants cannot regulate their own nervous system. Small children cannot regulate their own nervous systems. They do not have the capacity to do so. They literally need an external nervous system to regulate them. Okay? So that experience of, like, I've got a 4-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. She'll be 2 next month. And that 2-year-old, almost 2-year-old, she, when she loses it, when she melts, when she goes limp and she's crying, and it's pointless to say, be quiet, stop, be quiet. I mean, she can't, that is not within her capacity. She needs me to get on her level, to mirror her face, to soothe her, to comfort her. And as I do that and I help bring her down out of that elevated state or up out of that collapsed state, it's literally building that capacity into her own nervous system. And so the experience of secure attachment is what creates the capacity for self-regulation. So if a child did not get that, if they experienced enough early trauma and or neglect, they will develop insecure attachment. They didn't get the mirroring, they didn't get the attunement, and that means they will not have those capacities for self-regulation built within them. All right? The research is absolutely clear that there is a strong correlation between those with compulsive sexual behavior disorder and insecure attachment styles. Okay? Which makes sense because what that means is that the compulsive sexual behavior is an external attempt to regulate an internal experience that they cannot regulate otherwise. They don't have the capacity for healthy self-regulation or co-regulation with others. And so they try to use something on the outside to change and manage the way they feel on the inside. Okay? That's the problem and the connection between these early experiences of neglect and trauma and compulsive sexual behavior. I think most of the time, that is a huge part of what's going on. Now, not every child who has neglect or trauma is going to grow up with compulsive sexual behavior disorder. There could be genetic components. There probably are some genetic components, but there's also environmental things like, did sexuality at some point get introduced and experienced as a means of regulation, of self-soothing? So a child who is neglected but learns to self-stimulate early on, that's a story I've heard over and over again. And that becomes their primary way of soothing themselves, to the point that they're grown adults and several times a day going to the restroom at their workplace, because that's the only way they can keep themselves regulated. That's not someone who just loves sex, right? Okay. There's also a tremendous correlation between sexual compulsivity and shame. This chart here is from a 2011 study. I've got the citation there. And the way you read this, I know it's a little bit complicated. Well, let me say this first. So this connects with what I was just explaining. For children to develop the capacity to feel guilt, they need help. Otherwise they'll be stuck only feeling shame. So when my little girl does something wrong, okay, at first she feels shame. And then when I go to her and I comfort her and I receive her and I say, I love you, baby, but that's not how we're going to act. That's not what we do. That's not good. But you're okay. I love you. Come here. Give me a hug. What am I helping her do in her mind? Create a distinction between who she is and what she did. Children don't get that without help. That is literally a developmental milestone that requires the help of an external nervous system. Okay? So a lot of times people with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, they're stuck in shame rather than experiencing guilt. And that's a problem because, see, for where it says shame there, and there's 3 arrows to hypersexuality, motivation, change, and proactive behavior. The line from shame to hypersexuality, there's a plus. See that plus? Shame is highly correlated with hypersexual behavior, but it is inversely correlated, negatively correlated with motivation to change and proactive behavioral change. In other words, shame, there's a high association. The more shame you have, the more likely you are to engage in hypersexuality, the less likely you are to actually have motivation to change or to act behaviorally for change. Versus guilt. Look at guilt. Negatively correlated to hypersexuality, but positively correlated to motivation to change and proactive behavior change. So there's increasing research that shows that this developmental issue of whether someone is more shame-based or guilt-based is also at the root of whether they go the route of hypersexuality and have within them the capacity to have motivation to change and to execute change behaviors. All right. We're going to talk now a little bit about impact on partners, families, and the self. Okay. And I'm going to give you a quick history lesson here. So when Patrick Carnes was first, beating the drum and a one-man parade. Oh, yes.
Can medication stop addiction? A common side effect of birth control is loss of sex drive.
Yeah. I would not treat sex addiction with birth control, but there's a lot of medications where there's a side effect of loss of sex drive, loss of libido.
And I guess you're going to be talking about this, but the question is, how do you treat sex addiction?
Yeah, we are going to get into that a little bit, but I will just say that there have been some studies looking at medication as a means of treatment. There have been very mixed results. I'll just say that, mixed result. Nothing conclusive, nothing at this point where people are going, this is it. And I will share my opinion that I don't think that's where the solution will be found.
You don't say that again? You don't what?
I don't think that's where the solution will be found in pharmacology. Yeah. We will get into treatment here in a little bit, toward the end. Okay, so Patrick Carnes in the 80s, he's saying sex can be addictive. He's talking about this. Now, what did he do? He did what everyone does whenever they're pioneers in a field. He pulls from what exists, right? And builds on top of it. And so at the time, what was the primary model for addiction, treatment? And it's AA, it's the 12 steps, the 12-step model. So Carnes built on the 12-step model. And so now we've got what's called S fellowships. So using the same steps as AA, except applied to sexual behaviors, we have SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sexaholics Anonymous, SLAA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. So there's all these different S fellowships, 12-step programs around compulsive sexual behaviors, okay? There's a robust, very robust, healthy recovery community here in Houston around these. Well, in AA, you've got AA for the addicts. Where do the partners of the addicts go? Al-Anon. Right. Al-Anon. And in Al-Anon, you work on what can be called co-addiction and or codependency, which is to say, how do I not enable my partner to drink? How do I not try to manage my partner's behaviors? Because that ends up being a part of the cycle, okay? And so when SAA popped up, S-anon popped up with it for the partners of sex addicts. And thousands and thousands and thousands of partners of sex addicts have been helped through S-anon and similar programs. However, there's a pretty important distinction between a sex addict and an alcoholic usually. So I do know of cases where people's alcoholism was secret. That is rare. People's sex addiction is almost always secret. If you're married to an alcoholic, you probably know. If you're married to a sex addict, it's entirely possible you don't know. That's a pretty big difference. So the traditional models viewed the partners of sex addicts through a lens of co-addiction or codependency because, and I'm grateful for those that went before us, and once we know better, we do better. But they were just trying to use the existing structures, the template of AA and Al-Anon, right, and to help these partners and families. But it didn't fit. And here's what was happening. And I've met women, and I've worked with women who had this experience. It's 1994. A woman's husband was arrested for soliciting prostitution. She had no idea. He's a deacon in the church. They've been married 35 years. She had no clue, and it turns out this was just the tip of the iceberg. He goes off to 90 days to a residential treatment center. Okay? She gets a phone call with him once a week on Saturday afternoons. He's 7 weeks into his stay, and she gets the Saturday afternoon call, answers the phone. There he is. Hey, my therapist had me write something up for you. And over the phone, completely unprepared, he now recounts 35 years of infidelities. What do you think that did to that woman? Destroyed her. Destroyed her. And that happened all the time. Again, I'm not trying to shame the people who did that. They didn't know better at the time, but now we know better. Because there's been a huge paradigm shift to understanding, to what's called the partner trauma model, understanding that the partners of sex addicts are experiencing not codependency, but psychological trauma after the discovery of betrayal. Barbara Steffens, who is actually a dear friend of mine now and colleague, she's just a wonderful, wonderful woman. In the mid-2000s, her PhD research she surveyed, it was a huge number of women who had discovered that their husbands were sex addicts and looked at their trauma symptoms. And basically what she did was she just asked the question, what is the best way to view and understand these symptoms? What model or what lens best explains what's happening in these women? Is it codependency, which, by the way, there's not one stitch of peer-reviewed evidence for something called codependency? Think about that. Or trauma. And so she compared their symptoms to the symptoms of PTSD. It was glaring. This is trauma. This was like a bomb went off in the field. It was like a bomb went off in the field. And so now, just a few years later, she formed APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Specialists, which I'm on the board of. And she helped us to see that the experience of these partners upon discovering this betrayal that they knew nothing about, or maybe they had little hints about, it's traumatic. It's traumatic in several ways. I named 4 categories here, and just some examples of some symptoms. Physiological symptoms: hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, muscle tension, panic attacks, appetite changes. Cognitive emotional symptoms: intrusive thoughts, emotional numbness, anxiety, depression, self-doubt. Relational symptoms: so trust issues, avoidance, over-checking behaviors, checking the phone, checking the bank accounts, checking. Emotional detachment, fear of abandonment, and existential symptoms: loss of meaning, spiritual crisis, identity confusion, hopelessness, cynicism, etc. There's a 2019 study that I think is super important on this point. This is a study of women who discovered infidelity in their marriages. And this is a quote. It says, the integration of the findings discussed herein suggests that infidelity-based attachment trauma manifestations may resemble disorganized attachment behavior. Here's what that means. Disorganized attachment behavior is this like, come here, go away, I hate you, don't leave me, I want you, get away, get out of my sight, I love you, I can't stand you. Back and forth. It looks like borderline personality disorder, and there's a high correlation between the two. The only way to arrive at having disorganized attachment that we know of is when the person or people meant to be the source of comfort and security simultaneously become the source of threat and distress. I love you, I hate you. I need you, get away from me. Back and forth. And what this study found was that even women who were securely attached began to show these behaviors upon the discovery of the betrayal. It's an attachment trauma. It's really important. The other thing, and I'm not going to read this whole quote to you, the other thing that's important to understand about betrayal trauma, I think, is that while there is a lot of overlap in the symptomology between betrayal trauma and PTSD, where there is a break is that with PTSD, there's a whole category of symptoms called avoidance symptoms, where you try to avoid reminders of the betrayal. But with betrayal trauma, they keep revisiting it. And Stan Tatkin, who's a doctor of psychology out of California, an expert in couples therapy, he talks about this forced hippocampal review. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that, like a file cabinet, keeps all your memories aligned and has like a storyline of your life. And when you just found out that your whole story as you knew it, your marriage as you knew it for decades isn't what you thought it was, it's like someone took that filing cabinet drawer and they just dumped all those files all over the floor, and your brain is panicked, needing to put those files in order to keep you safe. Because you can't anticipate a threat in the future if you don't understand what the threats have been in the past. So this forced hippocampal review, but you were aware, but how many times? Tell me again. Wait, but you were aware, but... And so many therapists, not knowing any better, have said to betrayed women, stop ruminating, stop thinking about that. You need to quit asking those questions. It's only stirring you up. No, that is a safety-seeking behavior in their brain. They need the data. In my clinic, we help sex addicts tell the truth, take a polygraph to verify it, answer all their questions, all their partner's questions, and it's amazing how quickly the partner's brain settles down. It's like, okay, now I know. Now I know. So that's an important distinction between betrayal trauma and PTSD. What about the impact on children? Well, there's not a lot of research on this. Not a lot. There needs to be a lot more. I've got someone in my clinic who's very interested in this field and about to start her doctoral work, so I hope we get a little research out of her. But they grow up in a system where these 5 things are present, and they can carry them forward. The children can carry them forward. Commitment conflicts, values conflicts, self-control conflicts, negative consequences, and lack of sexual responsibility. The negative consequences, things like, that's obviously things like divorce and, public humiliation if a parent's found out or something like that. But these children, there are profound effects on these children. Sadly, the children often see the betrayed partner's heightened symptomology as the problem. Okay? Mom won't forgive dad. Mom is being mean to dad. Well, mom just found out dad slept with 1,000 women over the last 25 years. I mean, that's not an exaggerated story. That's one I've heard many times. Well, I think mom's doing pretty good, but the kids don't see that, right? And so now you've got this triangulation going on in the family system and all this internal conflict going on. It's an increased loss or trauma for the betrayed partner, okay? And the children can then get pulled in the middle. So there you have it. In impact on the self, how do these compulsive sexual behaviors impact the person who is actually carrying them out? Well, higher levels of shame, less relationship satisfaction. So porn use actually decreases intimacy, decreases emotional connection. It increases tolerance, meaning you have to seek out more of it or more extreme images or whatever, or videos. And sexual dissatisfaction in real life relationships. The number of men in their early and mid 20s who I have seen who have erectile dysfunction and cannot have sex with an actual flesh and blood woman is staggering, because they have masturbated and looked at porn since they were 10 or 12, and they cannot, literally their systems have not developed to be with a real life flesh and blood woman. It's really, really sad. It's easier to treat porn-induced erectile dysfunction in a 60-year-old than a 25-year-old, because the 60-year-old at some point probably was sexual with a real person. And so that underlying development is actually at least there. Higher risk of infidelity, obviously. Development of addictive patterns in the brain, so that cue reactivity, desensitization, and craving. All right, so some future directions for the field, and then any questions you have, I'm happy to take. So there is a growing recognition of this diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder in both the clinical and research communities. I mentioned the ICD-11 recognizes compulsive sexual behavior disorder, but there is still this debate. Is it impulse control? Is it addiction? I definitely think that the research is coming out that it's going to fall on the side of addiction. And I do think that the day will come when it will be in the DSM, because the evidence will just be so overwhelming. I really talked a lot about this earlier, but I did want to point out one thing on this slide in particular. The middle there where it says Golder et al. 2023. So this is a newer article, just not even fully 2 years old yet, about a year and a half old, that found two distinct subtypes of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. Pleasure-driven, so those driven by positive reinforcement, and escape-driven, those driven by negative reinforcement. And these were just very clear in the research. So some people with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, they're using the sexual behaviors to seek the thrill, to seek the high. Others are using it to try to escape the despair, escape the shame, numb the pain. And that's important because there needs to be different treatments for those two types. Okay? I'll talk more about treatment here in a second. There's a whole brave new world that we are entering now with technology and virtual reality and AI involved. Any technology that humans come up with, humans will sexualize, period. I mean, that has been the case for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. All right? And it will continue to be the case. And this, it's going to get real interesting with AI and virtual reality and all of this. But let's talk about these treatment-based modalities. So there continue to be a lot of folks operating from an addiction-based model. So this is a 12-step model, lots of cognitive behavioral therapy, lots of talk therapy, lots of thought exercises, behavioral exercises, do this, don't do that, kind of things. Attachment-based models, that's what I've primarily worked out of, attachment-based models or emotion-focused models, where, yeah, we're going to do some, top-down work, we call it, CBT work, cognitive behavioral therapy work, but we're also going to try to get at that underlying affect dysregulation, that underlying, whether it's chronic shame or despair or pain. We've got to get at that, and we've got to help them cultivate healthy relationships, secure relationships, to build the capacities that they didn't have that led them to seek out these behaviors compulsively in the first place. Neuromodulation is a form of neurofeedback where the actual parts of the brain are stimulated. We've been doing some work with that in my clinic, partnering with some other professionals. Very interesting work there where we actually map the brain and look at what parts of the brain are functioning more or less successfully, and can we stimulate the brain in ways to change the way it communicates within itself. And psychedelics, which I think is one of the most promising avenues out there. And right now, here in Texas, the Texas legislature, there's a initiative for ibogaine to be granted, basically for research to be done on ibogaine for combat veterans, where there's a lot of addiction in that community. But ibogaine, there are case studies of people with sex addiction, pornography addiction, but also like heroin and methamphetamine addicts who with I think it's something like 72% of heroin addicts with one administration of ibogaine cease all cravings. And it goes up to like 90-something% with 2 administrations of ibogaine, which is a psychedelic. It's incredible. I've just completed a 1.5-year-long fellowship to become a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist, because I really believe this is going to be a big part of the future if we can just get it legalized. There's another lecture series.
Like it's a means to remedy?
To what?
Like the psychedelics are a means to remedy addiction?
Yes, absolutely. Psychedelics themselves, for the most part, are not addictive. There's a whole history as to how they ended up as Schedule I drugs right alongside, heroin and cocaine and all of this stuff. It's very, very political. But yeah, go ahead.
Psychedelics are not meant to remedy, they're meant to help with the processing system, so with another therapy process.
Can you repeat the comment so that the people online can hear?
Yeah, they're not. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, they're not meant to remedy, but they can assist in a therapeutic process. So the psychedelic itself, what the research is showing is that the psychedelic itself is not what's therapeutic. But when paired with therapy, it can have a therapeutic impact. What it seems to do is it so highly increases the connectivity of different parts of the brain that it allows people to break out of very entrenched patterns of thinking and feeling and believing, to be able to think and feel and believe from different perspectives. The brain is then in an open plastic state beyond the actual psychedelic experience for a window of up to a few days. And so what's really important is what happens in those hours and days after the psychedelic experience, the meaning that's made of it, and the practical action and behavior that's taken around it.
Is this related to the CIA research project in the 60s with mind control and psychedelics?
Well, I mean, it's related in that they both used psychedelics. Okay, yeah, the question was, yeah. Well, hold on. Let me repeat the question for the people online. So the question was, is this related to the CIA mind control via psychedelics, those experiments in the 60s? The relationship would be that psychedelics are involved in both. And yes, people on psychedelics might be in an open, suggestive state. And yes, that can certainly be abused, which is why, like in my training program, hour after hour after hour after hour was on the ethics of working with people in altered states. but I don't know much about the CIA program because I don't want them in my world. Yes.
Sorry. So as a mental health professional who works in, thank you.
Yeah.
Who works in sex addiction, what is your personal take on House Bill 1811, or as most people know it, the Texas porn ban? Do you expect any pushback from the adult industry in these kinds of law in the future? And what kind of, have you seen effects propagating from this law already in your practice?
Yeah. So I love it. In England, you have to opt in to getting porn. So you can get porn in your home via the internet if you want. You just have to call and opt in. And that protects children. The brain of an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old cannot handle high-speed internet pornography. It is absolutely traumatizing. It is scarring. And the fact that people push back against simple age verification is beyond me. You can hear the passion I have about this. But that's because I get the phone calls from the mothers of the 14-year-olds. I've worked with the 16-year-old who cannot stop, wants to and cannot stop exposing himself to older men online. Okay? And it all starts with high-speed internet pornography getting into their house. These brains cannot handle it. Has there been pushback? Absolutely. And they're trying to use the First Amendment. Well, my goodness. I mean, is it... Those magazines are behind a shelf, at a grocery store or whatever. Can't we put it behind an age verification portal to protect children from those harmful effects?
It is my understanding that lie detector tests are pseudoscience. Is that true?
That depends on who you ask, and it depends on who does it and how it's done, and what you're claiming to get from it. So we utilize polygraph in a therapeutic way. It is not a forensic polygraph. So we first of all, we tell our clients this is not foolproof, but we use therapeutic application, which means it's a supportive process. There are no gotcha questions. There's no, heat lamps, sweat lamps, none of that. It is, we want you to pass. We want you to be able to give your partner, your wife, husband, we want you to be able to give them some external validation that you're not consciously withholding any truth from them. I have been a part of literally thousands of polygraphs, literally thousands. I can put on one hand two hands, the number of times that someone passed a polygraph and later we found out they were lying. And I can it's barely two hands now because it's up to 6. I know of 6 cases out of thousands I've done where someone passed, but something more came out later and they knew about it. They hadn't just overlooked it or forgotten it. The other thing I'll say, though, is the flip side of that is we've had people come where supposedly they've given full disclosures, but there was no polygraph used. We're going to do it again with a polygraph. Guess what? They suddenly remember so much more. It's just the darndest thing. So we're not talking about this being admissible in court or anything like that. So it's a different use of the technology.
So it's a therapeutic tool to aid hippocampal review, right?
It helps the partner to have something to trust other than the word of the person who's been lying to them for years. Yeah.
So what's the overlapping of personality disorders and sex addiction?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've seen ranges all the way from 25 up to nearly 50% of sex addicts having some personality disorder. I think it's probably closer to that 25% range because addiction mimics some traits of some personality disorders. Narcissism, facets of rigidity, that kind of thing. However, it is really important to understand when there is a personality disorder on board, if we can catch it earlier, because depending on the personality disorder, that might change the treatment modality that we used. For example, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, different than OCD, like check the lock 7 times or whatever. Obsessive compulsive personality disorders is marked by really rigid thinking patterns, okay? Really high personal standards for self and others. Those folks, when addicted to sex, have a very different expression of their sex addiction than others. And we are learning in our clinic, they need a whole different form of treatment than the more standard sex addict. Great question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you explain sexual addiction disorders in the context of cultural? Would you mind going a little bit deeper into? I don't know if you had experience with this or any of your colleagues have had experience with this. The context of sexual addiction within the context of cultural values and accepted behaviors or not. For example,
Right.
sexual. When is it considered to be sexual addiction versus when is it considered to be something that it's accepted within your cultural sphere?
Yeah. So I think you came in late, but which is fine. No, which is totally fine. But at the very beginning, I talked about the criteria for addiction, and it's I won't move all the way back to that slide, but it's things like needing more to achieve the same high. It's things like attempts to stop that failed. It's things like continuing despite negative consequences to self and those you love. Those are the markers. Those are the sorts of markers we're looking for. There are definitely cultural differences in sexual practices. So one that comes to mind that we just had a discussion about this. We were staffing cases, with my team the other day, and a family skinny dipping together. Okay, what's going on there? And we had a whole conversation around, is there a cultural element at play here, right? Because if the behavior is based on culture and it does not have those other markers, then no, that's not sexual addiction. Yeah. Any other questions? Y'all had really good questions. Those were great. Wow, that felt good. It felt like y'all were listening because you had good questions. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, hey, this QR code right here, if you scan it, I've got like some free webinars you can have, and I wrote a book called about couples-centered recovery. So how couples heal together. You can get that for free. I'm giving that to you for free if you want it. But that's all at that QR code right there. My email address is down there on the slide. If you have any questions or if you want these slides, I'm happy to send them to you. But I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for attending.